Well, we'll get rolling with this. These are always a little difficult to do due to the fact that this is a brand new seminar that I just got done building 5 minutes before Ross came online. But bear with me. We'll try to make it as exciting and as educational as possible. Now, of course, this is the Navionics webinar series, and we're talking about summertime crappies. I want to preface this by saying that a lot of the information that I learned for, techniques on how to catch these fish, I learned on the Crappie Masters Trail. And I also learned a lot of them growing up, fishing the Mississippi River. Did a lot of fishing in the summertime when the walleyes supposedly lost their teeth and got tough. That's when we'd go pan fishing. And of course, for some of you Southern attendees, you may not understand or appreciate this, but I learned a lot about crappie fishing through the ice as well. And Ross, being from Minnesota, he could probably relate that to you. But we're talking about summertime crappies. We're talking about big crappies. And we're talking about crappies from the top of the United States, say like in Minnesota or even Canada, down to the Florida lakes, over to Texas, lakes connected to the Mississippi River and other rivers, central United States like Missouri and reservoirs there, or anywhere in between, like one of my favorite lakes here, Grenada, Mississippi. What I tried to design with this seminar is something where everybody watching this could learn how to maybe catch more crappies and also travel to different areas and find these fish. A lot of these tactics I learned, again, across the United States. The most interesting revelation I had years ago was fishing on Red Lake, Minnesota in the summertime and going to launch the boat. We didn't really have anything going on that summer for walleyes. I had to take some people out fishing, and they were curious as to, just catching any type of fish. So we went up to Red Lake, Minnesota. The people that ran the ramp, and they charge, at a lot of the accesses across the United States. Up in Red Lake, it was no different. Back then, I think in the mid-2000s, it was $10 to launch, and they waived the launch fee. They said, you're wasting your time. At this point, all of the fish that we used to catch spawning have moved to the other side of Red Lake. And if anybody understands Red Lake, they know that this is an area that is off limits to anybody other than the tribe up there. But we can fish this area right in here. And I thought, well, we're going to give it a try. But remember, when they're spawning, everybody thinks, or everybody actually is a really good crappie fisherman when they're up shallow. And you go up into 2, 3, 4 foot of water, you pitch jigs into the trees, into the stumps, and it's easy. That's where they're spawning. That's where all of the fish are actually gathered, is up in that area. But what are we going to do? Where are we going to catch them? When we can't catch them up shallow, we're going to go out deep, and we're going to try a multitude of methods. Here you can see some open water trolling. We do a lot of trolling outside of the trees and in reservoirs with planer boards, as you can see in that bottom down there. I'm not going to cover that in this seminar. We've covered trolling planer boards outside of the timber, but you can check, and I'm going to show these slides later in the presentation at the end. In our archives, May 2015, we did trolling planer boards for crappies, and that was about how we won the championship in 2013. We also covered this in 2016 to where we actually did a webinar series trolling jigs for crappie, and that was archived February of 2016. So anyway, where do they go? How are we going to approach these fish? What are we going to look for? In lakes and reservoirs across the United States and even in rivers, what I'm going to look for is I'm going to look for areas away from the shallows and out in that open water. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to lay an initial plot trail. I'm going to look in that area from 1 foot of water out to maybe 14 foot. If I can't find them there, then I'm going to move out into the basin. And what I'm going to do out in the basin is I'm going to move back and forth and go fairly quickly. Now, most people's sonar is set up to where they can cover that water at, say, 5 to 10 miles per hour. I'm going to cruise fairly quickly. In fact, I've got my boat set up so my Raymarine can read that depth at 40 miles an hour. And I'm going to look for fish and store initial coordinates. Now, here you can see that I'm moving along at about 3 miles an hour, and I'm locating what I feel on my unit are crappies. How they're going to mark on my unit, most other units, is they're going to be a little bit more round, where a walleye might be a nice long arc. Northern pike will mark like that as well. Gar, carp, other fish will mark as a long arc. Crappies tend to mark like a big round blob. And as you can see here, when you mark a bunch of them, all in conjunction with each other, that's a good school of crappies moving at 3.1 when you've got 10, 15 fish on the screen. When I mark these fish, I'm going to store a coordinate. I've got it set up to where wherever I touch this, once I go to save a coordinate on my depth finder, I can actually touch a coordinate on that screen and lay a coordinate down just by touching the screen. So you've got to figure out on your chart plotter how to actually mark fish and then store a coordinate on it in your individual way. Here it shows where we're going out. We're cruising 40 miles per hour, and we can actually mark those fish. Another great way to find school of crappies is to look for the birds. The birds are going to be locating those minnows. They're going to be feeding on the same thing that the crappies are feeding on. So if you can find that bait and you can find those birds, oftentimes you're going to find the fish. Now, a good scenario in catching the fish in the spring and also catching the fish in the fall would be Grenada Lake here. And here you can see the large part of the lake to where we've caught them in the springtime up in the shallow water areas down here in the bottom. If you look up top here, there's a lot of flooded timber and shallow water areas up there. And then down here in the bottom here, you can see some more shallow water areas. That's where oftentimes we're going to find them in the spring. In the summer, late fall, when we won the championship, we found them in areas like this right here. We found them up in these type of areas, in these flats, in flats like this over here, this area, this area. There's a multitude of areas that we found them in the fall. But in the springtime, here's a picture of us catching them. They were up in flooded stumps. Now this might be what it looks like now. In the spring, they would get a lot of rain, they get a lot of water, the stumps, fields flood. And if you look out there, there's a lot of places for crappies to hide. Here's a picture of me and Kyle when we won the Classic. Those fish were caught right outside the timber pulling planer boards. Looking on the map now, what we're going to look for is where are those fish at located in the summertime. And right here is what I concentrate on. I'm going to look at these creek channels, these main tributaries that flow through the system. Oftentimes you're going to find secondary channels flowing into these. You're going to find another creek channel coming in here. Presentation or location first. I'm going to look for maybe areas where I've got two creeks conjoining with each other or joining together. So when we look at this on a grand basis, it can be fairly intimidating. But if you eliminate everything but the channels and that deeper water where thermoclines are going to set up, especially up here is shallow. When you move up here, here's the deeper part of that lake. Oftentimes as the water warms up, the thermocline will drop and keep getting deeper and deeper. And that means that the crappies are going to migrate to that deeper water and that deeper thermocline closer to that dam. And that's oftentimes where we're going to locate them. And again, keying in on areas where maybe a secondary channel meets a primary channel or two creek channels come together. Always a great conjunction, an area to troll and look for fish. Establishing the depth that these fish are at is very important. If I'm going to locate these fish out in, say, 15 foot of water, the biggest thing that anglers won't tell you is how they caught them or exactly where they caught them. But if you talk to somebody that's been successful at the ramp and you say, hey man, I don't want to know what you caught them on. I really don't, want to know your spots. I'm going to go to the other side of the lake from where I seen you headed from, but how deep were you fishing? Oftentimes, those anglers are going to tell you the depth. If you start marking crappies in, say, 10 to 15 foot of water, it eliminates the deeper water, it eliminates that shallower water, and you can focus on that 10 to 15 foot band. So find out what depth those fish are in, and in turn, that's going to help you achieve that more. Now, here it's a little bit tough. We've got 5, 10, and 15 foot contours, and this water is deeper than 15 foot. Gets up to 20 foot deep out here. That's oftentimes where your incremental depth lines of 1 foot can really come in handy. It also points out different structure. So when you get into 1 foot contours, you can see that right here, this looks like a big long point. Well, it's a big long point and it's got a flat on it. Here's another big long point that extends out into the deeper water. Here you can see flats on that point. Another thing that 1 foot contours are going to tell you is they're going to tell you where there's a sharp break. Here all the lines get together and that it actually gets really, really deep in those areas really, really quickly. So you've got sharp breaks. Here's another sharp break. Here's another sharp break. So what we're trying to uncover here is we're trying to uncover the pattern on where these fish are located. That's why it's really important to have good mapping. Now, what we've been doing a lot with Navionics is what's called SonarChart. You've got the 2 different layers of maps on your Platinum maps or your Navionics Plus. You've got sonar charts and you've got nautical charts. The nautical charts are the standard Navionics charts, or they're the lake and river charts for literally tens of thousands of lakes, more choices than any other map in the United States. But with SonarChart, what you've got is where anglers like you and me go out and drive around, and we turn a map that looks like this into a map that looks like that. Here's a portion of a lake that I did. Here on the left is the before, and you can see there's really no depth, no contours or anything, but you can see the creek channel that winds through. And here's after sonar charts that have been taken in this area, actually shows you the creek channel and how it flows through that area. Another way that you can do this is SonarChart Live, and you can do that with a lot of Wi-Fi depth finders. You can use Sonar Phone from Vexilar. I use my Raymarine unit in conjunction with an iPad to where I can actually do SonarChart Live and build my own maps. Now, these are maps that if I don't share these with the community, if you've got a secret spot, so to speak, this is a great way to save your mapping. And I may be getting a little bit adamant on mapping, but it's vitally important to have the best maps possible in order to unlock the key to the reservoir, the lake, or the river that you're fishing at. So let's say that we're going to go back to this portion of the lake. We're going to go back and we're going to cover Grenada Lake, or where we found those fish, or where we located these fish on any other reservoir where we're fishing. That's where we're going to employ spider rigging, or we're going to employ multiple poles in order to fish these areas. What's tough about Minnesota is you're not going to really spider rig. You're going to actually fish with 1 pole per person. You can have 2 people in the boat. You can have 2 poles. Kind of tough to fish spider rigs up in Minnesota. Now, that's where if you fill the boat and you take 2, 3, 4 other people, here my Ranger could actually hold 5 other people. I can put 7 into it. Up in Minnesota, you can employ 7 rods. But as you can see here, we're spider rigging along, and we're going to go through these fish. Now, the key to fishing 1 rod, 3 rods, 6 rods, 8 rods, 12 rods, it doesn't matter. What we want to do is we want to position our lures at the fish's eye level or above. As you can see here, we're in 16.6 foot of water. This fish right here is going to be about 8 foot deep. Now, if I scroll to that fish on most plotters and depth finders, I could tell each target, tell the depth of each target. Here could be one at 8 foot. Here's one at 10 foot. Here's one at, say, 12 foot. Here's one down at 14 foot, and here's a couple of fish and some bait and some clutter down here relating to the bottom. Place those lures at eye level above and stagger your baits. Here's another look at what we'd be looking at. Now we marked a fish down at 14 foot. That'd be this lure here. I'd put another lure, say, at 13 foot, put another lure at 12 foot, maybe put one up at 10 foot, and even higher. Biggest thing to remember with crappies is they're just like walleyes and other fish with eyes on top of their head. They're going to feed up. So never forget this upper water column. Always try to keep a lure, or always come and visit that area periodically with a higher lure like this. In other words, never forsake that water. Your depth finder, when that cone comes out of your depth finder, it actually spreads out as it gets deeper. And actually what it is your depth finder throws out lobs. The shallower your depth finder is, the smaller the cone area. Up here, you may be only covering about 1 foot of water in that shallower column. When you get down into 14 to 16 foot, you may be covering 5 to 10, 11, 12 foot, depending on the cone angle. But just remember, those shallower fish are harder to mark. Once we catch them, we're going to employ a bunch of different rods. I like to use kind of a twofold approach to spider rigging. What I like to do is I like to have, say, 3, 4 rods a side of the boat in the water where legal. Let's say I'm in Iowa, Wisconsin. You can fish 3 rods per state on our boundary waters. You can fish 3 rods per person on your inland waters. I would dead stick 2 rods or spider rig 2 rods, and then I would hand hold a 3rd rod. For that tactic, or handheld rods, I'm going to fish longer rods, get them a little bit farther away from the boat. I'm going to dip stumps as I go by. I'm going to go through that water and reach out to those fish with my handheld rod. In that instance, I'm going to be fishing the panfish series from St. Croix. I've got 9 footers, 10 footers, and 11 footers at my disposal. So I can reach out and touch those fish. I'm also going to use, say, these dead stick rods, 14 to 16 foot spider rig rods. When they're in the rod holder, they don't need a whole lot of sensitivity. You don't need an expensive rod. Panfish series, they're going to be a little bit more sensitive, or a lot more sensitive. That's where you're going to want to step up, spend a couple of bucks, and get a rod that's more your speed. Speaking of speed, speed is crucial when you're employing these tactics. Regardless if you're fishing out of the back of the boat or the front of the boat, oftentimes when we're spider rigging and we're covering water, or we're dipping and we're coming by, say, individual stumps, other trees and logs sticking out of the water, we're going to want to travel along at anywhere from about 0.3 up till about 1 mile per hour. And that's where speed is crucial. Good electric motor on the boat. What I use a tremendous amount in order to manage my speed is I use a drift paddle on the back of my power pole in order to go through the speed. And these things are amazing. When Mike Baker and I pulled a top 10 this year at Grenada, we were using drift paddles and 2 power poles out the back of the boat and going through a stump field like I showed you earlier. These things would hang up, slow the boat down, stall the boat, and all of a sudden they'd spring free. And I mean, we had them in about this position, dragging them right through the timber. And it was incredible how durable, and also how they actually bounced us off the structure and allowed us to move through that stump field and catch more fish. Now, when you catch a fish, when you're spider rigging or you're going along through that open water area, do not be afraid to pin the boat by dropping your power poles or power pole down and stopping your rods directly on top of those fish. That'll give you a chance to fire up where there's one fish. There's often more than one fish. Bang, 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 bang. You can pick up a couple of fish or a bunch of fish real quick. Let everything settle down. Quit getting bites. Lift the power pole back up to your trolling position. Put the trolling motor back in gear. Start drifting with the wind, and boom, you're ready to go. As you can see here, those drip paddles are pretty wide down at the bottom. They're narrow up at the top, but the farther you put them in the water, the more they're going to slow your boat down. And what I mean by speed being crucial is this man right here taught me this, Charlie Bunning. We went out spider rigging in his boat. We're moving along at 0.9 to 1 mile an hour. The wind was blowing us along. We didn't even have to use the trolling motor. You know, in most schools of thought, you're going to put down a drift sock. Well, Charlie put down the power poles, and we immediately slowed down to 0.3 miles per hour. So watch your speed, figure out, you know, what speed you're going, and catch those fish. On other areas across the country where I've fished spider rigs and individual rods in conjunction with each other are bridge pilings. And if you look at this bridge right here, this is very similar to a couple of the bridges that I fish over on Lake Oahe, to where they've got, over in South Dakota, believe it or not, tons of black and white crappies, most of them black, that suspend underneath these bridges. And why not? Why wouldn't they? They've got literally everything they need right here. They've got cover, they've got shade. Oftentimes moss and slime grows on these bridge pilings. And so with the spider rig, you could go along. Here you can see this angler's over in the shade. You can see a couple of anglers fishing on the other side of this bridge. But what I would do is I would first check and just quickly mark this area over here in the shade. If the current's blowing this way, those fish might be located down current and have their nose located right up against these bridge pilings. So you could literally spider rig or one pole your way, or a combination of both, all along through these bridge pilings and catch a tremendous amount of fish. Now, when we're cruising for crappies or marking crappies, oftentimes, even in areas like this, you're going to come across brush, or you're going to come across a brush pile. I look for brush when I'm moving along, or when I'm fishing. Oftentimes I'm side imaging, and I'll see something off to the side. Here I've got my side vision going from Ray Marine. Once I look into that structure and I locate that structure off to the side, oftentimes I'll store a coordinate and come back and fish that area. As we can see here, moving along these bridge pilings, I might mark a brush pile or a chunk of wood or a bunch of stumps out here in this open water. That would give me a chance to swing out and fish stuff that I never actually knew was out there. Another thing that we can do is we can look into the structure by using underwater cameras. And here you can see I've got this little itty bitty micro aqua view hooked up to my great big sonar unit, and it actually turns that small camera into a great big high depth television screen, so I can actually look for crappies as well. A lot of times we'll mark a lot of fish in areas like this, drop the camera down, and realize that they're not crappies. They could be tulipies, whitefish, gar, carp, sheephead, you name it. But oftentimes if you can't get them to bite, it's often good to know what they are by dropping a camera down or looking into that structure and looking for fish. Now, when it gets really, really hot, that's also a good time to go really, really shallow. And as you can see here, once this stuff gets flooded, it gets, say, 1, 2, 3 foot of water on it, a lot of these stumps are not going to be noticeable. But if on a closer examination of stumps, you start looking in here, and there's a lot of shade and a lot of areas where minnows and crappies can relate to when it gets shallow. So for summertime crappies, don't be afraid or don't overlook this type of structure. In other words, a lot of anglers will be thinking 10, 12, 14, 18 foot deep, that skinny water to where the bank goes right up against these stumps. And out here you may have 6 inches to a foot, just enough water to cover the back of a crappie. That's a great place to look and go up shallow and dip individual trees. I fish the Mississippi River a lot in the summertime. And anybody can find these type of brush piles you can see here on the right. Anybody can find this type of brush on the left. I'm going to fish, let's say there's a brush pile here, there's a brush pile down there. Usually you have to take a number to fish these brush piles. I'm going to fish all this skinny water in between the two and look for individual stick-ups like this, or oftentimes I can use side vision by going along and locating again those sticks or those brush piles under the water that nobody else can see. So again, don't be a follower, be a leader. This is a great place to catch fish. These are great places to catch fish. But after you've exhausted looking in these areas, look for the individual little stick or individual skin logs, skin sticks, and that means a tree without any bark on it. And oftentimes those are individual little one fish houses or little one fish structures. And as you go along and dip all of those between the brush piles, it can be an extremely successful tactic. Another thing I want to cover when fishing stumps, when fishing bridge pilings, when fishing individual standing timber. In other words, when you're going and fishing pole timber, which we fish an incredible amount in the summertime, or hedge trees. There's a way to approach these, and I'll kind of describe it by fishing one of these bridge pilings right here. Let's say you've got the current coming this way and flowing down along that bridge piling or along that stump or along that pole timber. I will come in with my boat, and first I'll dip the down current side of that structure. And I'll spend a lot of time on it. I'll start at the bottom, say down here in 14 foot of water, drop my jig all the way down, start working that area. I may jig it slowly up. Oftentimes what it looks like, if you look over here on the monitor, I'll just want to wiggle that jig really slowly and move it little 1-inch increments. And then I'll stop it. When you stop that jig, it is actually going to appear like a standard minnow in the water. You know, it's going to, minnows don't do a lot of crazy stuff. They don't want to be identified. They don't want to be picked out. They want to be real cool and real mellow. So they're going to stick and just sit there like this. Every once in a while, they're going to move. They're going to reposition themselves. And that's what we want to do with our jig. We want to reposition our jig by moving it slowly up. So I'll move it from 14. I might pop it and then stop it at 13 foot. But again, dead sticking those minnows or dead sticking your jig is vitally important to triggering strikes, because sooner or later that crappie will ooze in on that bait, and that's when it's going to attack that bait. So work the back side of that structure first, then move up to the front side of the structure where there's shade. And while I move up there, I'm going to fish this side, because maybe there's not a whole lot of current. Maybe those fish are going to be sitting on the side of that standing pole timber, or that bridge piling, or that piece of structure. Then move to the front of it. And here's a classic example to where the down current pocket is sitting down here, but the shade is upstream. And a lot of people think, well, there's not going to be any fish sitting in that heavy current. What happens in front of it, especially a big tree or a big bridge piling, is there's a bulge that's created in front of that, a bulge of water and current that's located in front of that piling that those individual fish can sit in. So that's a great place to look. Oftentimes when I jig, I'm going to jig it up slowly. I may pull it away from the structure with my rod tip. That's going to trigger strikes. I may slide it up and down with my line and the jig rubbing against that structure. And that's going to trigger a strike too. And just work each one of them. What happens is you'll start to develop a pattern to where all the fish are on the downstream side of this structure, and they're 12 foot down. So then you can hit this one, 12 foot down, you can hit this one, you can quickly bust over here and hit this one, or you can spider rig along with your lures in 12 foot of water and move up and down on each one of these pieces of structure. And that's a great way to cover those areas or those pieces of structure with your lure. The line that I'm going to use a lot of times, it's going to be a twofold approach. If I'm fishing pull timber, fishing bridge pilings, or I'm fishing stuff where I really don't care about pulling the structure off the bottom, I'm going to fish with super line. And the one that I like the most, I like a metered super line. What this is right here is it's 5 different colors, and it's every 10 foot. I really wish that they would have done 5 colors every 5 foot. But what you can do is you can take a Sharpie, a black magic marker, and you can actually put your own increments. You could split it at 5 foot, or you could do 2 foot increments. Anyway, taking that Sharpie and coloring that line yourself, what it does is it quickly tells me what depth I'm at. So if I put out 10 foot of this line, and another 10 foot of line would be 20 foot, and the fish are at 15 foot down, I know I got to be at 1.5 foot deep, and that's going to quickly tell me, you know, how much line I've got out. Other guys use their rod. If they've got, say, a 10 foot rod, and the jig's at the bottom of the rod, and the rod tips, you know, is going to be 10 foot above that. When you put your rod 1 foot above the water line, you know that your line is 9 foot, or your lure is 9 foot deep. And, you know, it's a great way to do it. Now, I get asked a lot of times, what knot do you tie when you're tying super line to your jig? And we've nicknamed this the Skarlini knot. It's kind of a cross between a trailing knot and a clinch knot. And this is how you tie it. You run that line down, you run it through the eye of the jig twice, or the hook twice, or your crankbait snap twice, but you run that line down. This is your line going to your rod. This is the tag line going through here twice. Pull this tight. With a trilene knot, you'd leave a double loop there, and you'd go through both of them. But with this knot, you come down, you go through twice, and you pull it tight. Then you come up, and you make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 loops around that main line, come back down, and you go through the loop that you created. I oftentimes will hold this tag line right here against the eye of the jig, and I will pull that knot or tighten that knot down, and I won't have anything to trim. Trust me, there's a reason that I use this knot, and one of them is that it's fast to tie because I don't have to trim it. I can pretty much tie 4 to 5 of these in the time that it takes most anglers to tie 1 Palomar knot. And I've never felt that this knot has failed me when I'm fishing in a tournament or fishing recreationally. Another nice thing about this knot is once this is tightened down, if you want to change jigs, you can take your thumbnail and you can quickly strip the line off of this jig, or off of your crankbait snap, so you can change and retie without having that knot stuck. With a Palomar knot, I don't know how many times I've dug into a friend's tackle box and I find 5 to 10 jigs with a Palomar knot still tied to that jig eye. So, you know, don't waste time by using those other knots. This is a great jig to tie. Again, you come down, you go through the eye of the jig twice, then you come up and you wrap it 8 times. You come back down and go through the loop that you created, hold that tag in against that eye, and tighten that knot or cinch it down. Now, when I'm fishing brush piles, small twigs, branches, stuff that, you know, that I don't mind breaking off and losing a jig to every once in a while, that's when I'm going to fish with a monofilament, high vis, very important, durable 10-pound test. In those instances, when I'm tying off to my jig, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here through the eye of the jig, make 7 wraps, and then go through that hole the same way that I did earlier. The only difference between this and the Skarlini knot is you only go through the eye of the jig once, and you only wrap it 7 times. When I tighten this, I'm going to lubricate that knot, or I might just slowly dry cinch it down. And the reason that I'm going to dry cinch slowly is that what happens with that knot is because you've created a little bit of friction, when you go to break it off, it's going to break off at the knot, and you're going to get most of your fishing line, if not all of your fishing line, back. Again, you got a little tag line laying out there with this knot. This is the position I like to position my knot in too. What that often will do is when you're fishing even up to a 3/8 ounce jig, that will make your jig ride horizontally like you see in this picture right here. If you've got that jig in the center a little bit farther this way, it's going to make that jig position a little bit more vertically. And, you know, I've talked to some really great crappie anglers, Mike Valentine, who runs Crappie Masters, Todd Huckabee. They tie different knots, or they aren't that concerned with their jig position. Todd Huckabee actually ties a loop knot and prefers his jig to be in more of a vertical position. So you know what? To me, it matters that this jig is placed in the back because it gives it a kicking motion and it keeps my jig more parallel. But as I've learned from talking to these other guys, there's more than one ways to skin a cat. This is just the way that I prefer it whenever I'm fishing. And you know what? You're going to get jiggy with it. What kind of jigs are we going to use? What are we going to fish with? When I'm fishing in dirty water, I like fishing a heavier jig. I like fishing something maybe with some flash. Roadrunners are great jigs for fishing around timber or open water trolling. And in the 1/4 or 3/8 ounce jigs, these are ones that I really like. These were designed for walleye fishing. It's the awesome walleye runner, but they're awesome for crappies too. Another good jig to use is a Hutch tackle jig. I like using these teardrop jigs. They seem to go through the water a little bit more aquadynamically, and they come in some really great crappie colors. The biggest key is they have an awesome sharp hook, so don't be afraid to use that too. And you can do it yourself. A lot of the jigs that I use are actually jigs that we pour out of do-it molds. You can find most, if not all, of these molds at Bass Pro Shops and other fine retailers. But you can see here, everything in common here is that they've all got a wire keeper. So regardless if it's a round ball jig, if it's a teardrop jig, or this one over here, which is great for fishing timber, this is called the Bat Jig. It was designed by Corey Batterson and worked on by Jerry Van Sickle and a lot of other people at the Do It plant. This Bat Jig right here, as you can see, has a very small gap between the hook and the eye of the jig. So it's going to get a lot less timber stuck in here, or going to get wedged up on a lot fewer branches. In fact, this jig is fairly snag-free when you're fishing. It will snag up, but nowhere near as much as more of an open jig. But these are all great jigs to fish in standing timber or in open water, especially. That's where I'm going to switch to these more open or bigger jigs. Another nice thing about doing yourself or making your own tackle is you can actually create your own tackle. You can put the hook that you want in there. So I could put a light wire hook for standing timber, or I could put a stiffer, sharper, more stout hook in there, or a bigger hook if I want to, fish for bigger fish. We get down into some of this standing pole timber like Truman, or down in Grenada, Mississippi, fishing bigger crappies, even 2-pound crappies down in Florida. I want a huge hook. I want a 2/0, 3/0, 4/0 hook. A hook that most people think is too big for crappie fishing. Most of the shapes, if not all of the shapes that I'm going to fish, are going to be your standard stick baits or your standard minnow baits when I'm fishing in timber. And here's a bunch of good ones. You've got, starting over here on the right, you've got the Power Bait Twitch Tail Minnow. Little limited in colors, but it's got these two right here, pretty much are going to get all of it. Or you can get down into some of these more neutral colors. If you've got clear water, that's a good thing to pay attention to. You get over here in the muddy water baits. This right here, these are garlic infused, and these muddy water carrot baits, or these stick baits, are awesome baits for fishing in timber. They're great for dock shooting. Here's the Daddy Shad down here. This is another tremendous bait. And then another great bait over here, especially when you're fishing with a minnow, because you can kind of pocket your minnow. Your hook sticks out right here, and your minnow kind of rides right here. Is the Slab Slayer by Bobby Garland. So a multitude of really awesome baits. And, you know, when it comes to color, you know, I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more later, but, you know, your brighter colors in dirty water, also your dark colors. These are great colors right here, these black and pinks, like this Daddy Shad or this carrot bait. You can see they all have that black and pink. Popular colors mean that they're popular to the fish. Junebug and chartreuse is great in dirty water. Black and chartreuse, all good baits to use in dirty water. The clearer the water, that's when I'm going to fish like something with this bluegrass, something like this platinum, something like blue and pearl. When it's overcast or dark, I'm going to fish with oranges and pinks. When it's bright out, I might focus on chartreuse. Now, just remember, these are my preferences. They're not rules of thumb, or you know, they may be a rule of thumb, but they're not gospel when it comes to picking out colors. I've seen times where you got dirty water and neutral baits really shine, like this 4th of July or this platinum or this clear silver shiner. So you let the crappies decide what baits you're going to use, and you'll develop your own colors and your own confidence. Another way to fish plastic is fish do it yourself. We had an interesting deal happen last fall. Corey Batterson over here, who, you know, likes to show off the fish because, you know, they're a lot more handsome than he is sometimes. No, I'm just giving you crap, Corey. But you can see Corey invited us to do a shoot, a television shoot. We had a Midwest Outdoors shoot to do, and Corey was gracious enough to put us on the fish. Kyle and I were going to travel down and fish with him, and Kyle works at the Do It plant. We've got access to all the molds, and what was cool about this is Corey told us the colors that they were using were either orange and white or chartreuse and white. And here's the box of baits that we, you know, not only start out, we had a ton of baits ourselves, but we wanted smaller orange and white and chartreuse and white baits to go down and fish down there. And sure enough, all the baits that we poured up were fish catchers. Corey even tried a few of them, and they worked out really good. When we talked about what colors to use, again, it can get really intimidating. What we found out that day fishing timber down in the reservoir that we fished is that when it was bright and sunny, this was the bait right here that really shined. When it was overcast, we used something with a lot of orange in it, still a little bit of white in it. That was the bait that shined. And then when we got out into the clear water, a plain dull lead head or a plain silver lead head, not a dull one, right when you make these baits, if you want to fish with silver, take your lead heads and dip them in a clear lacquer, and there you'll have a chrome or a metallic style bait for that clear water. And here you can see that bluegrass color. That was a great open water bait, or greater bait when we got out into the clear water, farther out from the creek arms where there wasn't dirty water. Another thing that I fish a lot with is I fish with jigs that I create myself. In these instances, it's really amazing what little hand-tied hair jigs can do. Here you can see this is a little head, but it's got a big hook on it. And here's a clear water bait on the top. Here's a dirty water bait on the bottom. I love fishing these smaller jigs around timber with a little float. A lot of times on the Mississippi River up in that skinny water, I'll take a float and a little line. And what I mean by that is tied to one of these smaller hand-tied hair jigs or grubs, I'm going to use this small Phil Stealth, just enough float to float, you know, that that jig won't sink it. You want the water line right at where the color begins. And I'm going to put 1 to 2 foot of line out when I'm fishing with that. Go ahead. And this is a great technique to use when fishing in farm ponds, especially with kids. A float is a visual, and you can go along and cast or dip every one of those pieces of timber. And again, it's a great tactic, and it suspends your bait. It dead sticks these little jigs below them, and it's a great way to catch them. Now, if you want to find a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, again, most, if not all of these products are carried by Bass Pro Shops. If they're not, talk to your store manager, and you can get them in there. But This is a great way to find all the rods, reels, line, lure, baits that we talked about there. Another great way to find out more about crappie fishing and learn a lot more is to check out the Crappie Masters and other tournament trails. You know, what's great about those is that you get done with the tournament, even if you don't fish it, all of the anglers will be there. The ones that did really good oftentimes want to talk about how they caught their fish. They want to share that with other people. The interesting thing about crappie or walleye tournaments or any other tournaments afterwards, the guys that didn't do so good in the tournament probably did pretty good in practice, and they're dying to tell you how they caught fish in practice. So oftentimes the anglers that were in the middle or the bottom of the pack, they're going to be a great source of information, and they're going to tell you how to catch those fish. Again, check out our archives, February, and I was amazed. I went back to look at some of these seminars that I had done in order to build this seminar, and I was amazed at the number of seminars and the information that Navionics is starting to archive. This one back in February 2016 for trolling jigs, and this one back in May of 2015 for trolling planer boards and crankbaits is another great way to do it. But in the meantime, Summertime Crappies, just stay cool, everybody, and stay awesome. And we'll look forward to talking about some questions here. We're going to bring Ross back on and start covering some questions if we have any out there.
Well, thank you, Tommy. Appreciate all the great information. The first question we've got is a gentleman asked in the middle of the presentation, can you go back on the slide, and maybe that Granada slide would be the best one. Can you take a minute and show the viewers exactly what you're talking about when you're describing these combination of creek channels and where you're, like, what you're keying in on those creek channels when you're looking at the map?
That's a great question. And what's interesting about the seminar is I thought that I'd be able to pull this off in about 35 or 40 minutes, and it still left out a ton of information. But here's the creek channels right here. As you can see, these black lines are formed due to the fact that as you look in on it, those black lines are these contour lines in these holes of that creek channel. As that creek channel was flowing down there, every time it would take a bend, it would create a deeper portion in that creek channel. So when we look at this from a bigger scale, those creek channels look like black dots or black lines that formulate and come together and make those junctions. So when I approach these, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to drive along, and I'm going to cover this fairly quickly the way I've got my electronics set up. But most depth finders, you can set them up in your boats if you tweak them and play with them. You can set up your transducer to where you can cruise along at 13 to 18 miles per hour and cover these. Now, once I start marking fish, then I'm going to come back, and oftentimes we'll go a long ways and spend a lot of time, and then all of a sudden we'll mark fish, like say in this area right here where two creek channels have come together. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to slowly work those areas. I'm going to come into this area and I'm going to spider rig, or I'm going to jig with, say, one rod or two rods. You can vertical jig the edge of these creek channels. Now here it shows that we've got 30 foot on the outside of these creek channels and 38 foot in the holes. It's interesting how those fish will suspend on these creek channels. If you're out of that creek channel, you're not going to catch any fish. Most of these fish are going to be relating either to the edges or the deep parts of those creek channels. And so I hope if that covers the question, you cruise along until
it does.
You mark fish,
yeah,
and you come back in and fish them.
Now the next question is, and it relates directly to that, and that is what are you looking for a specific structure when you're keying in on this, or this gentleman is asking about structure in general. But as you're talking about these creek channels, are you looking for those stumps and whatnot? And then maybe what are you looking for in the more natural lakes for the guys that might have been tuning in from the north?
Well, what's interesting is in reservoirs, oftentimes you'll find that the fish might be relating to standard timber or standing timber that's close to the creek channel. In other words, let's say you've got this area right here to where the shallow tapers out, and this may be all covered with standing timber, but the fish are only relating to the timber that's closest to the creek channel. When we talked earlier about depth and establishing the hot depth, you may find that the fish are in, and here's 1 foot contours, the fish are in 12 to 14 foot of water. So here you've got a 12 foot, a flat going from 12 to 13, and then you've got a contour going from 13 to 14 foot of water. So this band here, all along this reservoir, if you can see this right here, that 12 to 14 foot band, oh, there's a picture of Baker again. That 12 to 14 foot band is where those fish are going to be relating at. Another pattern to look for is, say, hedge trees that are out here, or fence lines that stick out into the reservoir. And maybe the fish are only on fence lines, and they're not on standing pole timber, they're not on hedge. But putting each one of those pieces of the puzzle together, are they on trees that are on the flats or the contour breaks? Are they on trees that are located or in correlation to those creek channels? Or are they on trees that are, basically somewhere up in the shallow water, the stumps up in the shallow water areas? That's how you put together the patterns. When we were natural lakes, like a red lake, like this lake right here, and I'm not zoomed in on that, but you can see as you zoom in, you're more of your contour structures. Those crappie may be related to points that stick way out into the lake, or they may be related to structure like humps out in the middle of the lake. Here's this point here. There's what it looks like without contour lines. And again, this is where mapping is vitally important to your fishing. And that's why I create a lot of my own maps by using SonarChart. But here you see a point sticking way out in the lake, and they may be relating to that. Now, in natural lakes, they could be relating to that last break or that last 1 or 2 foot contour before you get out into the flat, muddy basin. This could be sand here, this could be mud here, and this is the sand to mud transition all along this break right here. So what we found with crappies is oftentimes they're wherever the bait is at or the minnows are at. So if those shiners are up or those shad are up shallow, those fish are going to be relating to that area there. If those shiners or shad are out relating to rock structures, then those fish might be out there in natural lakes. Or if those fish are relating to fly hatch, like mayflies, that's where they're going to be out in that mud basin. As you can see here, here's that contour line. Here's a little bit shaded. Here's a little bit deeper contour, and here's the mud basin. When there's a fly hatch, this might be where I'm going to locate all of my fish at whenever I'm looking out there in natural lakes.
Okay. This is a great question. Jeff is wondering, when you are looking for, when you're targeting depth for crappies, are you finding that smaller ones are usually, and he's just using this as an example, are you finding that the smaller ones are, say, at 10 feet and the bigger ones are at 16 to 20 feet? Are you finding size by a specific depth when you're targeting these areas? He's asking about trolling jigs, but this applies to everybody that's looking for those summer crappies.
Well, a lot of times what we do is we find a lot of crappies and the size will be mixed up. You're going to have itty bitty crappies, all the way up to big crappies. And sometimes those big crappies are eating those itty bitty crappies. You got to remember, fish are cannibalistic. If they're feeding on small minnows, then oftentimes you'll have fish of all sizes relating to those as well. And then if they're feeding on big shad, and I'm talking great big shad, like 3, 4, we found 3, 4, 5, 6-inch shad inside of these 13, 14, 15, 16-inch crappies. Oftentimes there won't be a lot of little crappies relating to the great big shad, unless, of course, the shad are feeding on what the little crappies are feeding on. It's a tough question to answer due to the fact that it's oftentimes you've got to be the one that's got to figure out if there's little crappies, big crappies mixed in with little crappies. Now, on the standing timber and brush piles, oftentimes the higher fish or the more the fish that are going to pick off your jig first as you're dropping it down into that structure are oftentimes going to be those bigger fish. This is not always the case. But when we go fish a piece of structure, the bigger fish most times are going to be the ones that are the stacking order and have rolled into the prime higher feeding spot, working on minnows or shad coming from the top down. Other times, your bigger fish will be the ones right on the bottom with smaller fish up above them. Again, it's going to be a matter of deciphering and looking at your electronics. We can oftentimes pick out bigger fish versus smaller fish just by looking at our electronics.
Okay.
I got to find it here. Here you can see the bigger fish on the bottom. Here you can see the smaller fish up on top. And, that's the bigger fish will be oftentimes relating to a certain water column or a certain depth. So again, try to figure that out. Let your lures and your fishing tell you oftentimes where you want to focus your efforts at.
Okay. We got 2 more questions and we'll get you out of here, Tommy. I got a really good question, and it comes from Mario, and Mario's asking, do you have any general advice for the guys out there that are bank fishermen and it's summertime and you're telling them to go deep? Hey, not always accessible to the bank guy.
Well, I also said you want to look up in that shallow water area too, and I didn't cover it as much as I should have, but we can cover it now. When it gets really hot, especially, those fish move up, and this is why. Look at what you've got up shallow or close to the bank in a lot of areas. You might even have, say, and not just in reservoirs. You've got the Mississippi River to where the water will be right up to the tree line. A lot of those maples and a lot of those oak trees and so on and so forth. But if you find maples and willows, there's oftentimes sand around those trees. Those crappies will be tucked right up into that root ball, right up there. Another thing that you're going to want to do when you're crappie fishing as a bank angler is, if you want the meat, you got to use your feet. You got to cover a lot of bank, man. And what I mean by that is you can actually take your jig and you can swim it along as you walk. And most anglers won't even fish that shallower water. That's where those long poles, those 9, 10, 11-foot St. Croix panfish series rods are really going to come in handy, because you can dip out farther from the bank than you could with a short rod. And then again, don't forget the float tactic, taking that small float, small hair jig, small jig with a grub on it, or a sinker and a minnow, putting about, say, 1 foot to 2 foot of line underneath that float and casting it out, reeling it back real slowly. Move 10 foot down the bank, throw it out again, reel it in real slowly, and you're going to cover a lot of that water and fish for fish that a lot of people don't find. Now, when you're walking along and you're swimming that jig 3, 4, or 5 foot from the shore, and all of a sudden you feel your line rubbing a stick, slow down, because you've just found an underwater piece of structure that more than likely is going to hold bluegills and crappies or other species like bass. You found an underwater hidden gem, and that's the next time you go to that honey hole, you're going to want to remember that little spot.
Perfect. Okay, last question. We'll get you out of here tonight, Tommy. We really appreciate all your time and energy tonight. And this is also from a gentleman by the name of Jeff. And Jeff's wondering about trolling crankbaits in the summer. Now, I know you got a whole webinar on planer boards and whatnot, but how do you decide when you're spider rigging versus trolling cranks? How are you making the decision on which tactic you're trying, whether it's the bridge pylons, whether it's the creek beds? What are you how are you making those bigger picture decisions?
You know, for me, it's all by preference. You know, we've got I've got a couple of buddies of mine, Jay Burris and Chris Bushart, tremendous anglers, and they like to spider rig. I, on the other hand, like to troll planer boards and crankbaits. And, you know, oftentimes trolling planer boards and crankbaits, you can cover a lot more water and sometimes pinpoint or locate the fish that way. You can also locate brush piles flatlining crankbaits. If I go out, though, and I troll planer boards and crankbaits around or planer boards and jigs around, and I'm not doing so well or I'm not catching as many fish, then it might be time to slow down and go spider rigging. You know, like I said, Burris and Bushart, they'd rather start out spider rigging, and if that isn't working, then maybe they're going to pull crankbaits and planer boards. I, on the other hand, like to start the other way. So first part of that question, to answer it is, you got to use your preference. Now, you can spider rig, and if you think of two 16-foot rods, one on each side of my Ranger, I'm going to be covering, what, 24-foot, 30-foot of water with you know, a 30-foot wide swath. So that isn't that bad. And you can use tadpoles, offshore tadpoles, which is a diving device, or you can use 1 and 2 ounce weights. And you could go along and you could speed spider rig at 1 mile an hour, 1.2 miles an hour. You can push crankbaits with those tactics. You know, there's a lot of different ways to do it. What I've found sometimes as a rule of thumb, though, is trolling planer boards and crankbaits could trigger some strikes on a cold front. More often than not, the guys that spider rig and sit right on top of those fish or move into the cover and sit on top of those fish, those crappies get tighter to the cover, they get farther down deep in the cover, then they're going to be a little bit tougher to approach. So, you know, the biggest thing is use what you feel good about, but try to cover water fast first, find the fish, then you can slow down and fish them with, you know, bobbers, spider rigs, one pole, whatever way you want to do it. But that's how I determine it. I just determine on kind of how I can catch the fish. And sometimes I'm bored with planer boards and crankbaits. I prefer one pole or spider rigging because it's something different. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, no, it definitely does. First of all, Tommy, thank you for the depth of knowledge tonight. Greatly appreciate it. Folks, take a look at Tommy's other presentations that he's done. If you've got some friends or family that you're interested in telling them about this will be on Navionics website here in about 2 to 3 business days. So it'll also be available for your friends viewing. I want to thank each and every person for tuning in tonight. I want to thank Tommy Skarlis for your time, your energy, and your effort. And Tommy, you are definitely proving that you are not just a walleye fisherman. You are definitely coming at it and finding the crappies as well. So we're excited to have you tonight. Thank you for your time tonight, folks. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, and I appreciate everybody's time.